Hi, folks. I'm Ignatiy Vishnevetsky.
And I'm Alex Dowd. Welcome to Film Club. Film Club is our weekly movie discussion series where we talk about what's new in theaters and what's coming soon. Today, on what will be our final live Film Club, we're going to be switching formats come August. This will be our final live one. But today we're going to be talking about Dunkirk, the new Christopher Nolan film, and also another war movie.
A war for the planet of the Apes. I always want to say it's War of the Planet
Me
of
too,
the
although
Apes.
4 makes a lot
so
more
we're
sense.
going out with a bang, a war
right.
double feature.
So let's start with Dunkirk.
Sure.
Yes. So this is the new Christopher Nolan film, as you can see by this.
By this very Nolan-esque choice of typeface on the poster behind us.
So I think when this project was announced, there was some concern with some that this was going to be kind of so Nolan over the years has become kind of addicted to spectacle. He started out as a pretty small filmmaker, making films like Memento.
And before that, following a film which is made for something like, basically the price of like 2 pairs of shoes.
It's essentially a student film.
Yeah,
you know?
it's a sub-student film budget. It's quite ingenious in how it uses that budget. Maybe we'll get back to the relationship between that and everything else. But let's
over the years, I think he got kind of addicted to making these giant movies on giant budgets. I think a lot of people looked at this and said this is going to be sort of the apex of that, where Nolan is even moving away from science fiction. He's just making a big war movie. I think, a
very old-fashioned kind of war movie. This is really a very 1955 kind of idea of a war movie.
Except it's really not, though, in a lot of ways.
Yes. Yeah. Conceptually, it's an ensemble cast. It's shot entirely in 70 millimeter. Yeah. It's taking in the States, a lesser-known but a fairly important event in World War II, which is the evacuation of British, French, and I believe also Belgian troops from Dunkirk in 1940. Successful evacuation of over 300,000 troops. As its subject.
You can imagine a lot of different versions of that movie.
And it's got Kenneth Branagh and a bunch of other people.
You can imagine a version of that movie that would play exactly like a giant old-fashioned Hollywood war epic. And this certainly has the scale and the budget and even to some degrees the tone of that occasionally. But Nolan doesn't do that. Nolan is much too ambitious as a filmmaker to let that simply be what this film is. So there's actually, even getting into what this does is a little complicated because in a lot of ways this movie is as structurally and chronologically complicated as Memento and The Prestige. Yeah. So the film essentially looks at the Dunkirk evacuation as 3 different sort of events within events.
It's basically taking the structure of the back end of Inception and applying it to
nesting doll structure.
The nesting doll structure. Applying it to a totally non-sci-fi setting, but in a way that is actually kind of pointed.
Yes, meaningful.
It is very purposeful here.
Yes. So you essentially have, a number of filmmakers might give you 3 advantages on this.
Yeah, and when this was announced, it was announced as just that it was 3 stories, and I think, like everybody else, I mentally imagined, each third of the film would be
its own thing.
Yeah, would be its own thing.
Right. You'd see Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3.
I mentally imagine. I'm not sure how else I would imagine. I spiritually, physically imagine. But yeah.
So one portion of the film is set over another portion of the film is set over an entire day. And the third portion is set over a single hour.
And these run concurrently, by the way.
Yes.
So basically, one of the neat tricks of the structure is that the climax of the movie basically runs the entire length of the film
because it's that hour.
Yeah, because that hour-long section is also the climax of the week-long and the day-long story. It's kind of where they all overlap.
So he's essentially he's cross-cutting between 3 different timelines, and it's not just that they're happening. I'm getting lost even describing it, but it's enormously ambitious structurally and chronologically. The other thing is that this is a big stodgy war picture in a lot of ways. It's essentially a sort of suspense contraption.
It's speaking of following between. By the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pose them in the comments. We will answer them to the best of our abilities. Now. This is, we mentioned Following at the beginning, is very, very low budget debut. This is his shortest film since Following. It's only 147 minutes long. Yeah. It's a very, very, by his standards, a very tightly constructed film that is basically one suspense set piece after another. Most of the characters don't have names, or if they're credited with names in the cast, their names you never actually hear anyone say. You know, he does have a problem with kind of very clunky, clumsy exposition in some of his films, which does happen here, mostly from Kenneth
There's
Branagh.
not
But
that
it's
much dialogue in this.
but the thing is, I think it stands out a little more because there are just parts of this movie with no maybe for the first 15 minutes, there are 2 or 3 lines of dialogue.
Yeah. I think this is purest filmmaking in a lot of ways. I mean, also, one of the things about Nolan that I think bothers some of the detractors, and I'm mostly pro Nolan.
Yeah.
But one of the things is that for somebody who has sort of thrown himself into big blockbuster filmmaking, in the past he hasn't shown that much skill at action and at space and at staging a lot of moving things.
Well, because it's
bodies in motion.
Yeah, this is a classic complaint about his style, and I actually think this comes from I have a kind of pet theory that every filmmaker carries their super low budget roots over into their
big stuff.
Yeah, to the big stuff. It's like everything they did to try to make like a calling card film, to make something impressive, it becomes a reflex. And for a lot of people, it's trying to like be really impressive, you know? Like Scorsese, Spielberg, all the filmmakers of the 70s generation, they're still pulling off like the most complicated camera move that they could possibly afford. Because it was their kind of their first instinct in the like early 70s. How can I get a camera to turn around 360 degrees in a car and impress people in Hollywood to show them that I can do this thing? They're still doing that. And it's strange because Nolan's film Following is a movie with none of that. It's a movie that's basically built around trying to hide the fact that most of the cast can't act, that it was shot over the course of a year in weekends, that there's basically no film stock, very little direct sound. They couldn't afford any props. They can't afford any locations. So what you end up with is this filmmaker who's working on a very big budget, but who basically shoots everything in singles and assembles his movies from little pieces that they don't fit together in a conventional way.
Which that can be a real problem in an action scene.
Yeah, it's great for something like The Prestige is my favorite Nolan film, and I think it works tremendously well in something like The Prestige. But when you need to mount big action scenes, and this is why this movie's kind of a big leap forward, right? When you need to mount big action scenes, it doesn't really work. I don't think the big action scenes in The Dark Knight are very good.
No, I mean the action scenes are not what people love about the Batman films.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, but this sort of takes, because I think he's always had a pretty great eye, I think, and he can stage a great iconic image.
Yeah,
you know. And I think there's a lot of that in this, but also he's getting movement down more in this. I mean, the scenes that are set. So the third sort of story that I was describing is essentially 2 fighter pilots.
Yeah, Jack Lowden, I think is his name.
Is the character's name?
No, it's the other actor.
Oh, the other actor.
Because there's also Tom Hardy. Obviously, everybody knows one of them is Tom Hardy, who spends the entire movie in an airplane cockpit, in the Spitfire cockpit.
So essentially, that whole segment is in the cockpit of these planes.
Yeah.
And the aerial combat in this is some of the best I've seen.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and it's really interesting. The shots here tend to run a bit longer than I think, because Nolan's films are very, very, going back to the very beginning, they've always been super choppy, and that's been a big part of his style. The shots here tend to last a lot longer. There's a moment in the wordless opening in which the camera dollies and zooms behind a group of soldiers as they try to outrun machine gun fire. That really is like kind of Spielbergian and doesn't feel like anything else, and it sort of sets the ambition, because it doesn't feel like anything else in Nolan's films. He doesn't tend to use camera movement in a dramatic way or use long takes in a dramatic way. But he does
in this film.
He does here. There's a great moment during a bombing. Like there's a moment in the trailer.
The moment in the trailer is miraculous in the movie. You know.
But there's another bombing moment here where with these Stuka dive bombers that are constantly attacking the beach, where basically his camera just focuses on a character's hand as he covers his head, and then you just watch. The shot is probably 10 to 15 seconds long. You just watch all the bombs fall in the background as they're out of focus, getting closer and closer and closer and closer to where he's hiding, and it's a pretty neat little moment of suspense.
I mean, he lets the images breathe a little bit in this film, you know. And he also, I think it's also about what he's trying to capture about the headspace of these soldiers. Yeah. And one of the things I love, I mean, the structure is I appreciate the structure just for the sheer ambition of it, just for trying to do this with a World War II movie with this chronology is remarkable to me in and of itself. But part of what he's doing with that is he's suggesting that an event like this, like the Dunkirk evacuation, there are so many moving pieces, and the way that these different soldiers experience time might have been quite different. You know, I mean, he wants to, for the long segment on the beach, he wants us to feel that longer stretch. He wants us to feel. You okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm okay. Why?
Do we have a question?
Yeah. Well, yes, we do have a question. I didn't.
Yeah.
You're good. Thank you for checking in on my health. We do have a question actually before we move on to Apes.
Yeah.
From Kevin, who asks, who stood out the most from the cast for you? Because I do feel like actually this is a weak spot of the film. Is it doesn't?
I think the cast is fine. I just think
cast is fine.
They're not really characters.
Yeah.
Because Nolan is conceiving them, I think, as kind of gears in this giant machine. You know, I mean, he acknowledges individual heroism among this sprawling cast, but he's not really interested in them as individual people.
He's not interested in them as heroes. They're interested. I think what I do like about the film is he's interested in them as people reacting within situations, and kind of what constitutes people's reflexes. But the characterizations are kind of simple. No one really. The fact is, there's so little dialogue in this film, and so much of the movie is spent with the characters in some incredibly tense situation. It's like they get rescued from a ship, and then they get on another ship, and now that other ship is sinking. Yeah. So they spend so much of the film in danger that they never really get to. I think only Mark Rylance leaves much of a. Even Cillian Murphy, who sort of has the other role, he and Rylance spend much of the time together on screen. Rylance plays one of many hundreds of civilian boats from England that would participated in the evacuation, the little ships. And Cillian Murphy plays this officer that he basically rescues from sea after his ship is sunk by a U-boat. I think Rylance is pretty.
Yeah, I mean, he probably makes the biggest impression.
Yeah.
I think.
And even then, it's a stock character. It's kind of this like can-do. Yeah. I'm just an ordinary fisherman doing.
I mean, there's no Saving Private Ryan scene where all the grunts are sitting around talking about what they're going to do when they get home, or their mothers. You know, there's nothing like that.
Yeah,
in this movie.
none of the conventional characterizations you would find in a war film are present here. Interesting that this was filmed over the course of a year. No, Dave, sorry, you might have tuned in at the wrong point. We were talking about Following. We were talking about Nolan's debut, Following, which was made on absolutely no budget. That's what was filmed over the course of a year on weekends, because it was made for like I think $15,000. Yeah. This is a huge budgeted movie for I assume somewhere around $150 million.
It has to be. I mean, but it's amazing that with that amount of money spent on it, and the scale of the film, how intimate it often feels, and how much it operates like this kind of ticking clock.
Well, there's literally a ticking clock on the soundtrack.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the first things we hear.
Yeah.
You know, and the music is creating that kind of.
But let's
rhythm.
move on to a very different, but also very unconventional war film, which would be For the Planet of the Apes. I always want to say it's War of the Planet of the Apes because
War makes more sense though.
What?
4 makes more sense though.
Yeah, well, also because there's like no war in this film. This is a movie entirely, a Planet of the Apes movie that is part of this rebooted trilogy. Probably the best of these three films.
I think so, personally. Yeah.
Which plays out entirely from the perspective of the apes, with the exception of an opening sequence.
Which is one of the more radical things it does, I think. The earlier films hedged more, and sort of in the first film, I think you could even argue he's a co-lead with Andy Serkis playing Caesar again, the sort of cerebrally enhanced chimp who sets this whole thing into motion. And in the second film, they sort of create some, I would say, artificial balance between the apes and the humans, giving us a sympathetic human.
Yeah.
In this one, they're really like
not even trying sympathy for the humans.
Yeah. Like they're like at this point, every person in this movie, every human being in this movie, with the exception of a mute little girl we meet, is essentially an adversary.
Yeah.
You know, and with there's very little sympathy for them.
Which is something I really admire, and one of the reasons why I admire the first about hour of the film is how little it cares for the human characters. I mean, it's really up until they actually, because the villain in this film is played by Woody Harrelson, basically doing his best Marlon Brando. This is our second super ape Vietnam Apocalypse Now quoting movie of the year after Kong Skull Island, which is really, really weird when you think about it. It's sort of this deep impact
separately
Armageddon.
Separate projects. We're both just moving along and
it's
potentially aware of each other.
I know, but it's like a deep impact Armageddon kind of thing, except they're like, we're going to make this ape sci-fi movie, but it's all going to be just quoting Apocalypse Now non-stop. Who would have thought of that?
This one, even the words "Apocalypse Now" appear in the movie.
They appear on a wall at the exact midpoint, as the title of Apocalypse Now does in Apocalypse Now. So, and it goes far beyond that, right down to Woody Harrelson's shaved head, the way he is lit. His character is the Colonel. They're traveling to find him. He's kind of fighting his own guerrilla war against the apes. I'm telling you some of the plot here, but really for the first hour, until I think it's about the first hour, until they really encounter a lot of humans, this plays more like a Western.
Yeah.
And Serkis is really sort of doing as much as, even more than I think Hugh Jackman is trying to channel Clint Eastwood in Logan. Serkis is just, I mean, look at that gray beard. It's just outlaw Josie Wales.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of his 1,000-yard stare, and the voice too I think is very Eastwoodian.
Yeah,
you know, he's doing this kind of rasp, a lot of it. And by the way, adding a voice really does, like, every one of these movies has given Serkis a little bit more to do with this character, and a little bit more, a couple extra tools to make Caesar into a character. You know, in the first one, we're sort of seeing him come alive as a character. In the second one, he definitely has a personality. And in this one, they give him a voice. You know, and
well, he has a bit of a voice in the.
He barely talks in the second one, though.
Yeah, he does talk a lot.
He's
more
very silent.
And he finds another talking ape, Steve Zahn, who I think is quite good.
Zahn basically playing his character from Rescue Dawn.
Yeah.
As an ape. You know? So I kind of feel like sometimes I'm a little bit, I'm kind of cheese stands alone on these films.
That's what I went on to say, because I do know that you're not a big fan of. I mean,
this is my favorite.
You gave Dawn a positive review, but you were sort of on the low end compared to everyone else. So tell me what you think of this.
Well, I think all of them are technical achievements, absolutely, and the amount of empathy that they build for special effects. I run into this a lot, where a lot of films sort of are asking you to get invested in a special effect, and it can be tough, mostly because the technology often isn't there, but also because the movies don't know how to integrate it right. These movies are very good with that. You know, you forget at a certain point watching, especially this one, that you're watching special effects. You feel like you're just watching these characters who happen to be apes.
Yeah.
You know, but there's something about the franchise, the sort of franchise demands of this series, and the way that the whole thing is structured, sort of towards an endpoint, that has always kind of bothered me in a way. And I think a lot of it is that there's not a lot of suspense in a franchise that has a completely sort of predetermined destination. You know, in the second film, there was a lot of we're essentially supposed to be investing in this relationship between Caesar, the sort of the father trying to keep peace between the humans and the apes, and his mirror image, which is a human doing the same.
Played by Jason Clarke, right?
Yeah, played by Jason Clarke. That's correct. And we're supposed to get invested. Well, you know, will they be able to broker a peace? You know, it's in the title. Like, the movie is called Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. You know, these films essentially, to me, often feel like they're kind of there's a sense of spinning wheels to me. You know,
but you don't get that here, because I actually disagree with you, because I think it's become clear that even though they're going to fulfill this apes, first of all, I don't care. I don't care about. To be honest, I don't really. I'm a person who doesn't care about spoilers. I don't really care that much about plot as much as I care about things like narrative construction and characterization. But that having been said, it's made very clear in this film that though we're going to end up with a planet of the apes. They're going to live somewhere in a desert. They're going to have adobe houses. They're going to ride horses. They'll have their daguerreotypes or whatever they have in Planet of the Apes. The astronauts are going to land. That the locus of sympathy is going to be completely different. I think this film makes very, very clear. We're not going to have, if they make another film, it would be really strange if they made another film and then it was a remake of the Charlton Heston Planet of the Apes.
It'd be very bizarre, because that would be a total flip in identification.
Yeah.
You know?
And we just got sent our final question, which is from Dan, which was exactly it. Or will it shift to the perspective of the stranded astronauts, or do you think it will continue from the perspective of the apes?
Well, I guess that honestly is whether we're going to get another one is a question for the bean counters, and I think we probably will. I think this is doing pretty well, not as well as they wanted it to do.
Yeah.
I think, but so long as this thing is profitable, and I don't know what worldwide it's doing, there will be another one, and I am curious of where they'll take it.
I assume it's going to be the perspective of the apes. I have to say I enjoyed this. I maybe didn't like it quite as much as some of our colleagues did.
I just think it's a pastiche largely.
Well, it is a pastiche.
I mean, it's basically giving us a lot of. It's basically plunking apes down into a genre movie.
But it's into like a bunch of. It's like here's the outlaw Josie Wales. Here is Apocalypse Now. Here's Schindler's List.
Yep.
The Ray Fiennes scenes for some reason.
And there's something a little
tasteless.
A little tasteless about the way
Always.
this thing appropriates certain imagery and certain
wars, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, there's an image in this that I swear to God is the movie doing that famous shot from that famous photograph from the Vietnam War of that one soldier shooting the other soldier in the head. I swear to God, that image.
Oh
is
yeah, them
recreated.
him shooting the gorilla. Yes, I
Yes.
know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, there's always a problem.
At a certain point, does somebody have to stop and say, like, we're making a Planet of the Apes movie here.
These
Is it
are
totally appropriate for us to be appropriating that kind of imagery? It's such a serious movie, too. It's so serious.
It is very serious.
And yet it's also a film where orangutans are riding around on horses. You know?
It is. I think an issue is the fact that this is a horse riding ape film.
Yeah.
The third very serious horse riding.
So
ape.
serious.
All right. So that having been said, we're going to return in August.
We'll return in August. New format. Won't be doing these live anymore. So those of you who hated watching us doing this for 20 minutes, I have good news for you. It will not be that anymore. So thank you for watching as always, and we hope that you'll continue watching in August.
Yeah, and enjoy. There's a lot of good movies out this weekend.
There are.
I actually also quite enjoyed Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, even though it's quite dumb. And there are other things
Dunkirk,
in smaller, but probably
Dunkirk's
probably
easy.
you're probably going to go see Dunkirk anyway. We'll see you in August.
Thank you, guys.